I want to say to my babies that your mama loves you so much. I just feel in my heart that you're okay. We will do anything we will to help you to get them home. Please bring them home.
She sat in the courtroom in South Carolina on July 10, 1995, back straight, gaze steady, showing no flicker under dozens of eyes fixed on her. No panic, no sign of someone facing a sentence that could end her free life. Only tightly controlled, almost icy calm. Susan Leigh Smith knew every eye in that room followed her every movement. Defense attorneys argued she was depressed, that childhood trauma had caused her to lose control in a fateful moment. They said she was not a cold-blooded killer, but a woman who had broken down. For a time, that argument seemed to work. The jury listened. They took notes. They weighed whether a mother could truly do such a thing while fully aware. But then each piece of evidence came forward. The handwritten confession, the car pulled from the lake bottom, the two children still strapped in their car seats, and crucially, the way it all unfolded not in seconds, but over many minutes, long enough to think, long enough to stop, long enough to choose to continue. Throughout that process, Susan showed no clear breakdown, no strong reaction when details of her son's deaths were described in court, no direct apology to Michael and Alex, only emotions that appeared on cue and vanished when no longer needed. To some in the courtroom, that was not grief. That was control. This was not just a story of a crime. This was the case of a mother who killed her two children and then convinced much of America she was the victim. And every detail you are about to see is verified through court records, investigative reports, official testimony, and forensic evidence.
Susan Smith has been arrested and will be charged with 2 counts of murder in connection with the deaths of her children.
On the evening of October 25, 1994, in Union County, South Carolina, Susan Smith sat behind the wheel of a red Mazda Protege with her 2 young children in the back seat. Michael, 3 years old. Alexander, 14 months old. Both securely buckled into their car seats, just like any normal ride. Nothing in that moment suggested what was coming. It was simply an evening drive with no one but Susan knowing the true destination. Around 9 p.m., she left the residential area and drove toward John D. Tour, Wong Lake, a body of water outside town, rarely visited, especially at night. The road to the lake was dark, quiet, and almost without lights. This was a spot she had chosen. When she arrived, Susan stopped the car at the ramp leading down to the water, a concrete slope steep enough for the vehicle to slide straight in. She turned off the engine. No one was around. In the back seat, the 2 children were still alive. They did not understand what was happening. They could not unbuckle themselves. They could not open the doors. All they could do was sit there, completely dependent on the person in the driver's seat. According to Susan's later confession, she did not act immediately. She hesitated. She pulled the handbrake, then released it. She let the car begin to roll, then stopped again. That happened more than once. She said she tried several times before actually doing it, but each stop was not an end. Each was only a delay. Finally, she opened the car door and stepped out. Standing beside her vehicle with her 2 children still inside, Susan Smith shifted the car into neutral. No brakes, no holding back. The Mazda began rolling down the slope, slowly at first, then faster. The car slid into the water, producing a brief sound before disappearing into the darkness. Water began flooding inside. There was no way to open the doors from within under those conditions. The 2 children remained strapped in their seats. No escape, no help. The car sank to a depth of about 5 to 6 meters. And throughout that process, Susan did not jump into the water. She did not run after it. She did not call for help. She did not try to save her children. She stood there, then turned away. After the car vanished completely beneath the surface, Susan left the scene. She returned to another vehicle, drove away as if she had just completed something planned. She headed toward Highway 49, not far away. There, she stopped near a house with lights on. She got out, ran to the door, and began pounding. When the resident opened it, Susan already had her story ready. She said a black man with a gun had carjacked her at a red light. She said he jumped in, forced her to drive a long distance before making her stop. She said he pushed her out and drove off with her 2 children still in the back seat. She said she begged him to let her take the kids, but he refused. Every detail was delivered with just enough panic to sound believable. The homeowner called 911. Police were notified, and within minutes, that story began to spread. A carjacking, an armed suspect, 2 missing children, a surviving mother. No one at that moment knew the entire account she had just given was not what had happened.
Yeah, there's a lady that come up that door, and some guy jumped into a red light with her car with her 2 kids in it, and he took off, and she got out of the car here at our house.
And who's got the kid?
Yes, ma'am, in her car. And she's real hysterical, and I just decided I need to call the law and get them down here.
Get them going, Pam. They got 2 kids.
From October 25th to November 3, 1994, law enforcement in South Carolina, along with the FBI, launched one of the largest search operations in the region at that time. Checkpoints were set up on major routes, vehicles were stopped and searched, any car matching the description was examined. Hundreds of volunteers joined the search, walking through woods, checking lakes, combing remote areas. Photos of the 2 children, Michael and Alex, were printed on flyers and posted everywhere, from stores and gas stations to roadside poles. National media quickly picked up the story. Susan Smith appeared repeatedly on major television networks, the image of a grieving mother pleading for someone to return her children. She cried before the cameras. She appealed for help. She said she only wanted her boys safe, and in those early days, no one suspected her. Her story fit a familiar public fear, a random abduction, an unknown attacker. 2 children vanished without trace. But behind the scenes, investigators began to notice inconsistencies. They returned to the intersection where Susan said the carjacking occurred. No one had seen anything unusual at that time. No witnesses. No other calls reporting a similar incident. The traffic light system in that area was checked, and it showed the red light did not operate as Susan described. At that late hour, the light only turned red when triggered by a vehicle from the opposite direction. It could not remain red for the extended period she claimed. That meant the scenario she described, waiting a long time at a red light, could not have happened that way. Investigators continued to examine the spot where she said she was forced out of the car. There was no physical evidence of anyone being threatened with a gun and made to leave the vehicle. Everything was suspiciously clean. When they went back to work with Susan, the problems became clearer. Her timeline was inconsistent. She could not pinpoint exactly how long she drove. She was unsure of directions. Small details changed each time she retold the story. There were points she could not reasonably explain when pressed further. And alongside the contradictions in her statements were signs from her behavior. Investigators noticed Susan did not act like a mother with missing children. She did not actively ask about search progress. She did not constantly request updates. She waited for others to tell her, rather than seeking answers. When no cameras were present, she could speak normally, even smile. But before the public, she switched to near-instant anguish. The change was too quick, too obvious to ignore. One investigator later described her as seeming to turn emotions on and off depending on the situation. At one point, they asked Susan to take a polygraph test. She agreed. The first result showed signs of deception. They requested a second. The result did not change. She failed both. Though polygraph results are not admissible in court, to investigators, it was a clear signal. She was hiding something. While the public still followed the abduction narrative, the internal investigation had begun to shift. By November 3, 1994, after 9 days of fruitless searching, after a series of inexplicable contradictions, after 2 failed lie detector tests, police made a critical decision. Investigators focused on Susan Smith, and the most important question was no longer what had happened, but why. There was no sign of a carjacking, no other suspect, no evidence matching the story she had told. But every case like this needs one thing to complete the picture: motive. And as they began looking into Susan's personal life, the pieces started falling into place in ways no one had noticed before. Susan worked at a textile company in Union, where she began a relationship with Tom Findley, the son of the company owner. Tom was unlike the other men in her life. He came from a prominent, wealthy family with things Susan had never had, and according to those who knew her, that was exactly the kind of life she always wanted. Their relationship developed quickly, but not in the direction Susan hoped. Tom did not want commitment. He did not want to be a father. And most importantly, he did not want responsibility for the 2 children of the woman he was dating. That was stated clearly in a letter he sent her, a letter that later became one of the key pieces of evidence in the case file. I do not want children. I don't want the responsibility. It was not said in the heat of the moment. It was a direct statement, clear, impossible to misinterpret. For Tom, it was a boundary. For Susan, it was a problem that needed to be solved. In her later confession, she wrote, "I was in love, but he didn't love me." That statement did not just describe emotion. It described how she viewed the situation, not as a relationship ending, but as an opportunity denied. And if that opportunity was denied because of the existence of her 2 children, then the problem was not the relationship. The problem was the 2 children. To understand how she reached that conclusion, investigators also had to look back at her past. Susan was born on September 26, 1971. When she was 6 years old, her biological father, Harry Vaughn, committed suicide. Afterward, her mother remarried Beverly Russell, a man who later admitted to sexually abusing her for years. Those experiences were presented in court as part of the defense argument that she had psychological issues, that she was shaped by her childhood. But for the prosecution, what mattered was not what she had endured, but what she did with her choices as an adult. Her marriage to David Smith was unstable. They married in 1991, had 2 children, but the relationship quickly became strained. Both had affairs. They separated multiple times before officially divorcing in May 1994, just months before the crime occurred. After the divorce, Susan did not return to rebuilding a family life. She moved on to other relationships with Tom Finley at the center. At the same time, her financial situation was unstable. She lived in a small house with limited income, yet she longed for a better, more comfortable life, closer to what she saw in Tom's family. None of those factors automatically led to crime, but when combined with the way she viewed the problem, they created a very specific line of thinking. If the 2 children were the reason Tom left, if they were the barrier between her and the wife she wanted, if removing that barrier could change the outcome, then the solution, in her logic, became simple. In her confession, she did not speak of anger. She did not speak of losing control. She spoke of desperation. But even in that desperation, her actions still followed a sequence. There were still choices. There was still time to stop. And she did not stop. That made the motive no longer a moment of emotion. It became a decision that placed her personal needs above the lives of 2 children. A decision that did not end with the act at the lake that night, but continued with the construction of a false story that convinced much of America she was the victim. The trial of Susan Smith began on July 10, 1995 in South Carolina, less than a year after the 2 children were found at the bottom of the lake. Unlike the early days of the investigation when she appeared in public as a grieving mother, this time Susan entered the courtroom as the defendant in a first-degree murder case. The prosecution was not seeking a lenient sentence. They sought the death penalty. Their argument was simple and direct. This was not an impulsive act, not a moment of lost control, but a premeditated decision carried out through multiple steps and covered up with a lie that lasted 9 days. The focus of the trial was not on what Susan had done, that had been confirmed by her confession, but on how she did it and her mental state at the time. The prosecution began with the very confession Susan had handwritten on November 3, 1994. In it, she described driving the car into the lake, admitting she had hesitated multiple times before carrying it out. For the prosecution, that detail was not a sign of remorse, but evidence of awareness. Each pause was a chance not to do it, and each continuation was a choice. They moved on to physical evidence. When the Mazda Protege was pulled from John D. Long Lake, the car doors were found locked. That meant the 2 children had no chance to escape, even as water began flooding in. Forensic experts confirmed that Michael and Alex were still alive when the car began to sink. They did not die beforehand. They died inside the car as the water rose. To help the jury understand more clearly, the prosecution played a video reconstruction of the car sliding into the water and sinking gradually. It was not a long film, but it was enough to illustrate the process from the moment the wheels touched the water to when water began flooding the cabin to when the car disappeared completely beneath the surface. In the courtroom, many people could not look directly at the screen, but one person did not turn away. According to witness accounts, before the video was played, Susan was seen talking to the person next to her, even appearing to smile or look relaxed. No sign of tension. No sign of someone about to face evidence of her own children's deaths. And when the video began, when every eye in the room turned to the screen, she switched to another state. She bowed her head. She wiped tears. She displayed pain. That change did not happen gradually. It happened instantly. To the prosecution, that was not a natural reaction. It was a performance that could be turned on and off depending on the circumstances. Many other witnesses were called to testify about Susan's behavior in the days before and after the crime. They described someone who could shift from normal to anguished in seconds, especially when cameras or others were watching. They said her emotions were not unstable in the usual way, but seemed adjusted to the situation. The defense did not deny that Susan had caused the deaths of her 2 children. Instead, they focused on her mental state. They argued that Susan suffered from severe depression, that she had childhood trauma, that those experiences affected her judgment. A psychiatrist was called as a witness, explaining that Susan had a history of emotional disorders and relied on relationships to seek self-worth. They argued that her actions stemmed not from cruelty, but from an unstable mental state. One of the defense's key witnesses was Beverly Russell, Susan's stepfather. He admitted in court that he had abused her when she was young. He said he believed his actions had contributed to what happened later. It was a shocking admission, but for the prosecution, it did not change the nature of the case. They countered that many people endure difficult childhoods but do not kill their children. They emphasized that Susan had time to think, to stop, to choose another path. And she did not. Another detail presented in court was that Susan had placed her wedding dress and wedding album in the trunk before pushing the car into the lake. The defense argued it was a symbolic act, a sign of disorder. But for the prosecution, it was a sign of preparation, not just the act of murder, but a sequence of actions. From choosing a location, to driving the car into the water, to creating a false story afterward. After many days of arguments, testimony, and evidence presentation, the trial reached its final stage. On July 22, 1995, the jury retired to deliberate. After about 2.5 hours, they returned to the courtroom with their decision. In the silence, each word was read clearly. Susan Smith was found guilty, 2 counts of murder. What she had done was determined to be intentional killing. But the verdict did not end there. The next issue was punishment. The prosecution had requested the death penalty, arguing that the level of cruelty and premeditation in this act warranted the highest punishment under the law. They stressed that this was not a momentary outburst, but a sequence of deliberate actions. From driving to the lake, stopping, hesitating, then continuing until the car disappeared under the water. However, the jury did not follow that path. They did not choose the death penalty. Instead, they recommended life imprisonment, a decision that, even at that moment, sparked controversy in the public and legal community. Under South Carolina law in 1995, a life sentence did not mean the convicted person would remain in prison for life without any chance of release. It meant the person would be eligible for parole after 30 years served. But there was a crucial detail. The jury was not allowed to know that when making their decision, when they asked about parole possibility, the judge instructed them to understand life imprisonment and its common meaning, without explaining the specific legal conditions. That meant their decision was made within an incomplete information framework, and they believed that sentence meant Susan would never be free. Many later questioned whether the outcome would have been different if they had known she could be eligible for release after 3 decades. However, at the time, the biggest influence on the jury's decision was not the legal detail, but how they assessed the person standing before them. The defense had succeeded to some extent in bringing psychological factors into the trial. They presented Susan's childhood, her father's suicide when she was young, the abuse by her stepfather, the emotional disorder she was said to have experienced. Those elements did not erase criminal responsibility, but they created a context that some jurors could view as mitigating, leading them not to choose the maximum penalty. Meanwhile, the prosecution stressed that regardless of circumstances, the act was the result of conscious choices, and that Susan had many opportunities to stop but did not. In the end, the jury reached a middle ground between the two arguments. They acknowledged the severity of the conduct by convicting at the highest degree, but did not go to the maximum punishment. When the verdict was announced, the reaction in the courtroom did not explode. There were no shouts, no intense emotional displays like in many other trials. Susan Smith stood there, hearing each word read aloud. And more importantly, there was no direct, clear apology to the 2 children she had killed. After her conviction, her public image did not change in the way many expected. There was no public moment showing deep remorse, no full acknowledgement of responsibility beyond what was said during the proceedings. After the courtroom doors closed in July 1995, Susan Smith entered the South Carolina state prison system with a life sentence. But what happened afterward did not match the image of someone who had completely broken down or accepted the consequences. In the early years of her sentence, disciplinary records began noting violations. Not serious violent acts, but behaviors reflecting how she interacted with her surroundings. She formed relationships, sought attention, and in many cases, crossed boundaries set by the prison system. By 2000, an incident brought her name back to the headlines. Susan was found having sexual relations with a prison guard. The man was later prosecuted and sentenced to prison for the violation. The matter did not stop with one individual. It raised questions about how Susan could influence those around her, even in a tightly controlled environment. In the years that followed, reports continued to show she had multiple romantic relationships in prison, including with inmates and staff. Some who interacted with her described her ability to form quick connections, gain trust, and then use those relationships for personal gain. These behaviors did not happen once. They repeated over time, in different forms, but with the same structure: establish, control, exploit. Alongside that came money from outside. For many years, Susan received deposits into her prison account from people she had never met in person. Some were case followers. Some developed personal feelings after corresponding by mail. There were even cases involving filmmakers or individuals interested in her story. Even without directly asking, she maintained contact and accepted support, creating a system in which she continued to exert influence from beyond the prison walls. As time passed, a legal milestone approached. Under the law in effect at the time of her conviction, Susan became eligible for parole after 30 years. 2024 marked the first time she had the chance to appear before the parole board. On November 20th, 2024, she entered the hearing room and repeated what she had done many times before. She cried. She apologized. She said she had changed. She said she understood what had happened and would do everything to make it right if she could. But this time, the context was different. The board did not look only at words. They looked at 30 years of records. They looked at disciplinary violations. They looked at inappropriate relationships. They looked at how she continued to behave in an environment where every action was documented. And when they asked questions, the focus was not on emotion, but on evidence of change. What they saw was not enough to persuade. The decision was to deny parole, not a divided decision, a unanimous one. The reason was stated clearly, no indication of substantial change, and her history of behavior showed a repeated pattern of manipulation and violation. Susan will have her next opportunity in November 2026, but at that point, the board's conclusion reflected how they viewed the entire process, not just one moment in the hearing room. When placed side by side, what happened in 1994 and what happened in 2024 are not separate. Both involved the way Susan presented her story, the way she used emotion to influence others, and the way she responded when facing consequences. The difference is not in the behavior, but in whether the listener still believed, and after 30 years, the answer from the legal system was clear. Susan Smith was not seen as someone who had changed enough to be released. She continued to be regarded as a potential risk, not only because of what happened in the past, but because those behaviors appeared to continue in other forms. If you want to see more true crime cases with shocking twists like this, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. Thank you for watching. See you in the next stories.